Good afternoon, everyone. This is our final webinar in the series we've had around the guidance. Sorry, I'm just waiting for the screen to come up. So around the guidance, with John Ford taking us through for the final session. Just before we get into that, a reminder on how you can ask questions. You are in listen-only mode. You can ask your question through the questions tab, and if we can ask you to avoid the raise hand option, that would be great. This is being recorded. This webinar, along with the other 4 webinars we've had, have been recorded and will be recorded and will be available via the UK BIM Alliance YouTube channel next week. As a reminder, the 5 we've had this week, we've talked about information management function, information requirement, the common data environment. Earlier today, we had Jack talk about the BEP and tendering and appointments, and John's going to talk through information delivery planning. Before that, let's hear from Sarah and David talk a little bit more about the guidance itself.
Welcome to this webinar about the guidance supporting the BS-EN ISO 19650 series of standards. The UK BIM Framework is supported by BSI, CDBB and the UK BIM Alliance.
I'm Sarah Davidson.
And I'm David Churcher.
And along with Anne Kemp, we're co-editors of the ISO 19650 guidance.
The guidance is supported by a group of dedicated individuals who give their time and expertise for free. These individuals might be authoring or providing feedback on the content.
And you can see that David, Anne and I work alongside them in the management, editing and publication of the guidance. We also work closely with CDBB, who lead on the presentation of the guidance. The ISO 19650 series currently comprises Part 1, 2, 3 and 5. Part 1 covers the overall concepts of information management using BIM. Part 2 is specific to the delivery phase, design and construction of assets, and Part 3 covers the operational phase. Part 5 sets the requirements for the adoption of a security-minded approach to information management as a whole.
ISO 19650 Part 4 is currently under development, and it's due to be released hopefully in early 2022. The guidance was first published in April 2019 in the form of concepts guidance. Part 2 guidance followed in July and has been subject to update and expansion every quarter since then. We welcome and encourage feedback from the whole community, as this is fundamental to shaping the direction of the guidance. So if you have feedback on the guidance, please do email us on guidancefeedback@ukbimframework.org.
The 4th edition of ISO 19650 Part 2 guidance was 160 plus pages long, and this was clearly becoming unwieldy, and some of the key feedback from industry was that we needed to make the guidance more accessible. So in July of this year, we developed a new guidance structure that you can see here. We now have Part 1 guidance setting out the concept of the ISO 19650 series overall. Part 2 guidance considers the specific requirements of ISO 19650 Part 2, and Part 3 guidance, which has only recently been released, is starting to explain the requirements of ISO 19650 Part 3.
In addition, we have guidance parts A to F, which are intended to cut across the whole of the ISO 19650 series, and they cover key themes where detailed guidance is considered necessary. Guidance for Part 5 will be developed by the Centre for the Protection of National Infrastructure, CPNI, in due course.
So Guidance A covers the information management function and resources. It considers the activities that need to be carried out and offers a resource map supporting the information management framework.
Guidance B covers open data and building smart topics. It will also cover COBie, but this section is not yet written.
And Guidance C covers the common data environment in terms of workflow and technology. It looks at assignment of metadata as required by the National Annex to ISO 19650 Part 2 as well.
Guidance D is all about information requirements. It explains the fundamentals of what they're trying to do and the details of different types of requirements with some very detailed examples.
Guidance E currently covers the BIM execution plan in supporting tendering and appointment activities. It will be extended in due course with content to cover more tendering and appointment resources.
And finally, Guidance F covers information delivery planning. This includes the responsibility matrices and the task and master information delivery plans. It also has space for guidance on the federation strategy, but again, this is not written yet.
We hope this provides you with a little insight into the development of the guidance, and we'll hand you over to the more detailed guidance discussion just now. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. And I'm just handing over to John, who's going to take us through Guidance Part F, Information Delivery Planning. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Pam. Just get the slides prepared. Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining. For those of you who don't know me, my name is John Ford. I'm the BIM and Digital Delivery Lead at Galliford Try, a major construction contractor and specialist service provider. So I've been in the industry for over 15 years now. I've been involved in various groups with BRE, BSI, ISO, and now with the UK BIM Alliance from almost day one of me joining the industry, because I got thrown into something that was part of a project that was contributing to BS 1192-2007 as part of something called the Avanti scheme. So I got thrown into deep water almost from the day I joined the industry, and it's been a colourful experience ever since. So the focus today is to look at the UK BIM Framework guidance. So you've just had an intro for the moment, but I just want to expand on that a little bit. Why we decided to develop it, what was the objective specifically for the section that I developed, which was the Information Delivery Planning guidance, and what have we achieved with that guidance so far. So in collaboration between the British Standards Institute, Digital Built Britain, and various voluntary industry consultants and practitioners that form part of the UK BIM Alliance, a vast amount of literature and other forms of guidance material have been developed over the period of 2 years now, since ISO 19650 Part 1 and Part 2 was released. So we went straight into looking at developing some guidance. And as you can see, what it looks like at the moment is that it's been broken up into various individual guidance resources, starting with part 1 that focuses on the concepts and then going into the more granular detail in the other parts that focus on specific areas of ISO 19650. The presentation today is on the information and delivery planning processes, a piece that myself on behalf of Galliford Try volunteered to develop to help try and expand the understanding of this process, along with the working principles that govern its implementation and management on projects. What I would like to highlight to you is the key difference between these guidances and those published by individuals and organizations in the past is the key strength for how this has been developed by practitioners, for practitioners, and judged and quality checked against other practitioners before publication. Past guidances that were released were usually singular guidances created by a single organization or a small group of people, and they were usually single interpretations, which wasn't very helpful because industry leaders in this field would argue and question the validity of that guidance, and that was never healthy because you had different experts in the different specific fields all kind of arguing about how something should be done. So the guidance is the closest to a unified approach that you can get, and we've had some very skilled individuals that have come in and helped contribute either to developing the standards, developing the guidance, managing how the guidance is put together, and also essentially managing focus groups that challenge the guidance and contribute to what should be in there. So some very skilled individuals there. So as you know, we've got a number of new standards released in the past couple of years that form the UK's new standardised approach to BIM, referred to now as the UK BIM Framework. You see, that framework is made up of various standards which are quite hard to understand, even by many of those you may consider as BIM experts in your organisation or in an industry. So if you're like me and you like books with lots of pictures, which I do, I love those kind of reading materials, but you're still learning the concept of BIM and information management, then you may find reading these standards in the raw form quite difficult reads. And because the processes in these standards are multidisciplinary and they're multi-project stage based, the likelihood of those reading these standards and having a complete understanding of all those disciplines and the project stages along with how they interact with the whole information cycle is quite unlikely. There's no single person who understands every business function's information management and production process at every stage of a project, including the design, construction and handover stages. You just don't have that. And this is why the guidance is so powerful, because what it did is it brought those silos together, those pockets of experts. So experts in their particular field for how information should be managed, brought them together and got them to contribute to these guidances. So breaking down some of the silos to help cover all those stages. And this is why we had the issue we did with BIM Level 2 when that was rolled out. Like the UK BIM Framework, BIM Level 2 was defined by a set of standards, so it was underpinned by those standards. And you had to understand the project information management in its entirety, including all the outputs and tasks that were defined in the BS and PAS 1192 standards, and then understand the impacts that it had on the roles, projects and organizations. So interpretation was always widespread. You always had 5 different opinions, and there was no focus on any single preferred route. So it was always challenging from day one, really. So the guidance has been developed to act as a purifier of sorts for the contents of the standards, phrasing the complex terminologies into plain English to make it more comfortable, make it a more comfortable read, splitting the responsibilities down into the key areas of responsibility. So if you're a subcontractor, for example, many aspects of the standards don't apply to you. So the guidance helps, filter the bits that do apply to you and makes it easier to navigate the standard. What I must make clear is that this guidance isn't intended for any of you who are on this call at the moment as influential leaders in the BIM or information management arena within your organization, to just go out to your organization and say, look, everyone, there's these great guidances, go out and read those guidances. They will help you deliver information management and BIM. That's absolutely not the case. The main audience of these guidances are for those in influential positions and for those who generally want to understand the standards, to understand that so that they can then share that guidance out to a wider audience. And this is why ISO 19650 Part 1 states that you should have an ISO 9001 approach in place, which is that quality management governance process where you develop processes that are specific for your organization, for the specific type of people who are in your organization, so that they can go to those resources and work from that. So it's to help that process specifically. So there's been a lot of challenges around the information delivery planning process and the interpretation of how this should be done using ISO 19650 approaches, or even the older yet very similar 1192 approach. The primary objective was to tackle the confusion that we've all seen in industry and on social media around this particular subject. So one that was brought up as an area to tackle in the guidance was the misinterpretation of these tools like the MIDP, TIDP, and the breakdown structures, those kind of things. There was always a challenge around this, But then I'd find that what was typically happening on projects, and many of the others that help contribute to saying that this is an issue in the industry, is that we would find that organizations would go off and they'd create these MIDPs, let's say on projects, but they didn't actually reflect the way that the business used to manage their information. You see, the MIDP, for example, isn't a new concept. It wasn't invented by PAS 1192 or ISO 9650. It's been around for decades, but just didn't have the name Master Information Delivery Plan. That's where the standards came in and gave it a standardized name and a standardized approach. So many organizations have misunderstood and gone towards a new direction of creating a new tool with these new standards and giving it a standardized name rather than just enhancing what they already had in place, resulting in duplicate processes and efforts. So if your organization who were responsible for information delivery planning, for example, if your organization did have a key role in that area and they've gone off and created a thing called an MIDP, and you're not aware of anything in the form of a similar tool before this was done, I'd have a bit of an investigation, because like I say, if you've only created this tool now and you've not used anything from the past to help you inform this tool, then the question has to be, well, how was you doing it before these standards came into place? Because we've always managed information delivery in some shape, way or form. We've always done it, those in those key areas anyway. So I would always recommend you go back and just have a look to see what you're doing, because we have noticed that, you know, for example, in my area of expertise, which is design management, when I first joined the industry and I started working in the design management side, we had a tool for managing information delivery. We didn't call it an MIDP, we called it an information release schedule. And in that release schedule, we planned out what information we needed from the various parties. And then when we first understood the concept of the MIDP when 1192 was being produced, it was simply enhancing that current tool that we already had. We didn't go off and create something new, but sometimes that does happen, so just keep that in mind. So now you must ask yourself, if there has been, you know, a thing called the MIDP in the past before it was given that title, then maybe there are traditional tools or things that are in your organizations already for the other things that are mentioned in the standard, like the responsibility matrix and breakdown structure. You know, again, the standards aren't creating these and saying these are new things and now you need to start looking at them. We've looked at these at various points in the past before the standards, and a lot of them a lot of the good practices that were done on those projects were then just feeding into the standards. So the standards have just taken what was already there and tried to standardize it. The second point is we have the issue that people and organizations go off and create things independently as just like tick box exercises. So they've misunderstood how they integrate. So they create these TIDPs, MIDPs, responsibility matrices, but they're all independent and separate and sometimes don't feed into one another. They're just doing it because it's a bullet point in a standard. So the guidance tries to cover the integration of these tools and how some of these precursors to other tools, sorry. And what it tries to do in the guidance is explain how this is done traditionally. So how these things that didn't have these standardized names, how these fed into them to start with. So it gives you some context. The third point is we also have the challenge that similar worded tools are being misunderstood, like the assignment matrix and responsibility matrix. So in the standards, there is something called the assignment matrix, and then there's something called the responsibility matrix. And we have witnessed where somebody comes along and goes, no, that assignment matrix template that's in the annex of the ISO, that's the responsibility matrix, the same thing, so just roll that out, and it isn't. And that's, again, just a slight misunderstanding of terminology sometimes, because they are very similar worded, and then trying to just push something out that wasn't the intention of the standard. We also have, finally, in the guidance, the issue about how these things should be presented or the format. You know, should they be Excel sheets, Gantt charts, cloud-based tools, and should there even be templates provided by the guidance framework? So the guidance tries to cover that also. What I would like to highlight is that the guidance has only focused on 2 areas at the moment of the information delivery planning process. So there's like 4 key areas that forms part of the overall information delivery planning process, which is the federation strategy, the breakdown structure, the responsibility matrix, and the delivery plans. So the guidance here is primarily focusing just on the responsibility matrix and the information delivery plan, but it does touch on the breakdown structure to see how it feeds into those 2. And the guidance jumps straight into explaining that the process of information delivery planning often needs tools to help you to complete it. So, you've got to achieve an activity or task of some kind and you need a tool to do that. You've got this thing called an MIDP, and it's a tool. It's something that's helping you to complete an objective. And those 4 key tools are those ones that you see there, and they can come in different forms. The guidance so far will go through another iterative process to update on the federation strategy and the breakdown structure. We're just agreeing what the contents of that will be at the moment and how much information we need to contain within that. So that will be in a later edition. In the guidance, the relationship between the tools is discussed. So we've got these different things. How do they interact? How does one feed into the other? It tries to present it that there is a chronological order of these tools. For example, you must agree on how you intend on structuring your information containers to help you understand how you best then assign responsibilities. And then once you've assigned responsibilities, you can respond to that to say, this is what we're going to hand over. Then your project will go through the process of specific responsibility assignment. Again, this is nothing new. Principal contractors, for example, have been using responsibility matrices for decades, especially since the proliferation of design and build contracts. We had to take on huge amounts of responsibility in these new procurement routes, and we had to find a way to organize and assign responsibility. So, if you're a main contractor and you've got probably several dozen consultant subcontractors, you've got to say, designer A, you're responsible for this element, designer B, you're responsible for that. And then where there's interfaces, you've got to agree that as well, who's responsible for making sure that interface is resolved. The real issue has been how well did principal contractors do this? And again, I'm not limiting it down to principal contractors alone, because there are other types of lead appointed parties that have to organize their delivery teams and plan out who is responsible for doing what. So even lead designers in traditional procurement routes who obviously manage a design team, they still have to go down this kind of process to assign responsibility. But it's all about how well this was done before the standards. Did they just wing it and just hope for the best and that these responsibilities were assigned and then just react, have a reactive approach to everything? It's only when things go wrong, just solve it there and then. This example, which is provided in the guidance, shows an old responsibility matrix that I actually took from a 2008 project, which I helped compile. It assigns responsibilities for design elements, but also statutory compliance obligations. Looks like there's some planning management responsibilities, BRIAM, overall responsible for coordination. So you're going into that granularity of who's responsible for what. And you have to define these things for scope of services when you're compiling a delivery team, because you need to be clear on who's doing what. Only once you've assigned responsibility can appointed parties, your task teams, truly plan their deliverables. So if you assign the architect, for example, as responsibility for doors and ironmongery specification, then their immediate response should be to advise what door information they will provide. So you've told them you're responsible for the doors. They've responded back saying that they're going to give you a door and ironmongery schedule and some plans identifying locations. And then you may challenge them as part of the MIDP process and say, no, I need a specification as well, especially for these type of doors, because these doors have got special requirements, so give me a spec as well. And then you're just constantly updating the response as part of that responsibility matrix. So the guidance doesn't fall short on providing examples to try and explain the different concepts. It tries to demonstrate how one tool feeds into the next and illustrates the concept using various examples. It also goes on to explain sort of differences, like the difference between the high-level responsibility matrix versus the detailed responsibility matrix. You know, there is challenges there about how much you can only do while you're tendering for work, and depending on the procurement process, 1-stage tendering, 2-stage tendering, all that kind of stuff, how much can you possibly do when you're just going through that tendering work and feeding back a response saying this is our proposal? So again, we've always done that in the past. Again, as a main contractor, when we're looking at engaging with consultants or even subcontractors, we have to be able to tell them what we're expecting them to do, a high level outline of what they're to do, because they have to price that in, and that becomes part of our price and proposal. So again, these things are not new, they've just got new names and a standard way of approaching them in the standard. But the guidance also tries to tackle some of the common misconceptions that I have personally encountered, and what we've seen on social media and working groups, like the misconception that the assignment matrix is the same as the responsibility matrix. So it does cover that specifically in the guidance. This is where you know, they do take that crude tool from the back of ISO 9650 Part 2. They just fill in against clause references and think that that's absolutely satisfactory for assigning the specific granularity of responsibilities on a project, and that's not the case. Now, the guidance doesn't propose any templates or formats. It does provide examples, and quite a few, I would say, for illustrative purposes, enough for the detail, enough for you to understand what it's trying to achieve, but not enough for you to just copy and paste it and go, you know, I'm just going to copy and paste that now into my document for that project. It's there for illustrative purposes, to help you think about the challenge, what you've got to do. I do find templates the devil's work. Not everybody agrees with me, but I really do. They allow for laziness because people have got a lot of things to do, and if a template comes along and it makes it easier just to put a project name on it and dish it out, human nature seems to be that that is a lot easier to do, even though the risk that it creates can be massive. The amount of times I have been on projects, there's a dispute or something, and I know, oh, if I go to that document, that'll have the answer. And I find that the document is just a template, and sometimes not even completed. It's still got all insert text here, highlighted in yellow. And this is a real challenge. But when I find in the guidance is where it provides enough illustration to show you what things should look like or can look like, and provide more than one example. It not only allows you to think about how you need to create your own, but also the varying ways that you can go about it to try and make it more efficient, possibly even using digital tools in the market. And then these tools may just need then the update specific to meet the requirements of the ISO. Now this leads on to a very specific item. So what you see on the screen at the moment is a 2008 template that I just took from an old project called the Information Release Schedule. This is very similar, if not almost identical, to the MIDP. So this was a tool, and I took a lot out of it because obviously you can only show so much in the guidance, but it was to show how you plan your deliverables out and you get an agreement with those task teams, those delivery teams, to say what you're going to give me and when. And this all had to be agreed before the information got handed over. So what this is trying to do is provide context. So how you can use old tools, enhance them to just be more specific to ISO 19650. Another sensitive topic that the guidance tries to cover on is field IDs. As you can see here, there are no field IDs in this example. The long designations, sorry, if you're not aware what the field IDs are, they're part of the national annex. They're the long field segments of data that are captured as a way of providing a designation to each document and drawing. And it's currently in the national annex of 19650. Now, back then, didn't need field IDs. It's because what we just wanted to know was what information you're going to give me and when. How it was going to be portrayed was kind of agreed later. So for example, you'd say, I need the door schedules on that particular date. The fact that the architect needs to maybe split that out into several schedules to make it easier to read, because maybe we've asked for a lot of data in there. Same with floor plans. Sometimes, you know, with large buildings or linear assets, you know, you can't just get it all on one drawing. You've got to split it maybe over to 4 sheets, and trying to plan that very early on is quite difficult. So it was just make sure you give me that floor plan. If you're going to split it into 4, then that's fine, but I'll at least tick it off to say that you've achieved that objective. The 4 drawings, you've just split it up later on as you start to export it into sheets. So not only does the guidance provide these useful examples, but it does provide the most important thing, which is the context. For example, how the traditional tools compare to the modern tools. And here is an example that I cut down. Oh, that's interesting. That slide has disappeared, so I've got a bit of an error on that one. But extending on to the field IDs, there is a couple of myths that I want to just touch on, what the guidance touches on. And this is related to about how field IDs go into TIDPs and MIDPs, and believing that you've got to definitely have a field ID in compliance with PAS or the ISO standard to be assigned to everything that you're planning to deliver. Now, how many of you listening to this would agree that it's easy to predict a field ID naming convention of drawings and documents as part of your TIDP process? Usually, and the way the ISO states, you've got to do this before you go into appointment. And then obviously you update it as the project evolves. Now, if you answer, you know, it is easy, then I'd love to know your secret. And I'm sure many of us would too. And it's primarily because defining a specific designation, set of designations, including the unique ID at the end, at a very early stage, is extremely challenging, because you know that you've got to hand over some information, but you don't know exactly yet how it's going to be presented. And that's one of the things that the guidance tries to touch on. And we didn't have this issue in the past because we didn't really care about the designation of a drawing. We just cared about the information within whatever it was going to be presented in. So we wanted to know door information. Yes, okay, you can present it as a schedule, but it was what was in that schedule. That was the important bit. And I really didn't care if the schedule was split up into several schedules, really, unless obviously it landed on my desk and it looked an absolute mess, and I would say, well, why you done it that way? So predicting field IDs is one of the most difficult, in my opinion, and time-consuming elements when producing your information delivery plans, and one that I state in the guidance, I believe, and others agreed with me, that isn't even required. That's right, you heard me. You don't have to force field IDs into TIDPs and MIDPs. There's no definitive statement in the ISO that you must do this. Now, of course, the guidance isn't stating you can't use field IDs, so planning for those field IDs early in the future, or that you shouldn't. The guidance simply reiterates what the standard states, that you must have a name and description for everything you're issuing in the TIDP. For example, you could have a floor plan, and that's your name, and then a description of what that floor plan is, which is potentially a setting out plan or something that's specific to a floor. Now, the field ID is an assignment that should be provided in the common data environment. That's how the national annex goes about it. So it says that when it's being uploaded into the common data environment, you have to assign a field ID. It helps with the finding and recalling of information. So you'll have a name and a description, then a field ID, or you may have decided to drop the name, replace it with a field ID and a description. So it's how you go about the process. You should always consider that on a project, especially if you're in a position like the appointing party or lead appointing party, how that's going to roll out. The point I'm trying to make is that the MIDP, for most people, is not interested only in files. You see, the field ID in the National Annex is primarily focused towards files. And the update in the National Annex, which is coming, will also make that more apparent, that this is a field ID, a naming convention to be applied to files. But information containers is more than just files. Sometimes it can be files within files, like zip files, and then they've got contents, or model files, and they've got objects. So the MIDP is focused on information containers that may or may not be files, but perhaps objects within files and that kind of stuff. But the field ID is solely specific to the files, the things that get uploaded onto common data environment solutions typically, and the field ID is there to be assigned. This is very important and something I just wanted to clarify as part of this, because I find it's one of those challenges that we've all got, that we're all facing on projects at the moment, and it's taking up a considerable amount of time, and there's huge amounts of debates about this, not in just social media, but in active groups about how we go about this. And I do believe that sometimes if you've not got a good business case for why the field ID has to go into that TIDP, MIDP at the early, you're creating unnecessary work. Not all of you will agree with me, but I can tell you now that as someone who has created many of these MIDPs and taken TIDPs in the past, before it was even given that designation, I only care about when I'm going to get my door schedule or ground survey report and the ceiling detail. I could not care less what the field ID is going to be until it's issued. When it's issued and it's on the common data environment, the field ID serves me because it helps me filter down my information and find information quicker. But the only time it's offered something when it's been in an MIDP for me is that I've been able to essentially tick off, say that field ID was planned for this date, field ID didn't arrive on that date. But I already do that process anyway, because if I know if I need a door schedule tomorrow and I look on my solution and I can't find that door schedule tomorrow, then I know it's not there. So I don't necessarily need a tool for that because I have to do something with that door schedule tomorrow anyway. So I've got to manually look because I need to send it off to a workflow, get somebody to comment on it, or put it into a package ready for a procuring of a subcontractor. For those of you who know about this challenge specifically in your daily lives, this will come maybe as a surprise or perhaps a relief. Others may not agree. I can provide some examples on this and the pros and cons for each approach. The important thing is to ensure you find the best way to do this and remove all the possible waste in your organization. Have a standardized approach for how this is to be done. The final point is on mandating templates for your supply chain to use. Now, ISO 9650 does have the allowance to recommend templates, and in some cases, if I was a client and I did want a specific response during a tender, a template is very useful to make sure that I know where to find the answers in that. So sometimes these pre-appointment BEP templates that I've seen in industry, they're very useful. They allow a client to respond. But you've got to consider, again, that these things are tools. And what is the tool's purpose? Now, a pre-contract BEP, for example, is primarily a tool for the client. It's a tool to assess their supply chain to make sure that they are capable. And that is the primary objective of that tool. An MIDP, though, is different. An MIDP's primary objective is for the delivery team and the lead appointed party managing the delivery team's information delivery over to the appointing party. So if you do come with templates and say you are to use that template, you have to be absolutely sure that that template, that tool, is fit for purpose. I don't go to the guy that's going to put up a new fence on my garden and say, no, you put your tools down, use my tools. When I'm not in this trade of work, he knows more than me. So you have to be very careful about what templates that you use, especially if that template is a tool. It does something specific that the project team need to use. And the same goes for post-contract or contract award BIM execution plans, the stuff that is finalized and goes into contract, because really that isn't a tool anymore for assessing to see if your supply chain is capable. It's a tool for your supply chain to use to make sure that they are all able to communicate and do what they need to do on the project. So if you end up putting stuff in there that doesn't clearly do that, and you've pushed that template down, then you're probably adding pages of unnecessary work in there because it's not achieving the primary goal that that tool was designed for. So I just thought I'd get that one out there, because on the information delivery planning side especially, I see a lot of templates going around, and the amount of time you have to challenge these templates, because sometimes if you're forced to use that template, say, okay, we'll use it, but I can't use it in the way that ISO 19650 allows, because I still need to not track my drawings by stage, because some of the MIDP templates that I've seen, it's like, when is this drawing going to come at stage 3, 4, and 5, and doesn't allow for any dates. You see, I'm only interested in dates, not stages. So I want to know when my door schedule is going to come to me for comment, because that gives me a 14-day commenting period for when I need to send it over for the client for their review, and then it gives me another 14 days to say when it's accepted. So it's very specific for individuals to how they manage information on a project. And tools should be fed in by the people that use these tools, not by people that just create the tools and say, use these standard common approaches. So they're areas that I wanted to focus on quite specifically within the guidance, and I hope I got that through quite well. So again, any of this that you disagree with, you can feed that back via the website or directly via with myself, because really what the guidance is trying to do is to, if it's got a message across and you don't agree with it, then we need to get that message across better so it explains and that there's necessary backed up evidence. This isn't stuff that we try to just pick out of thin air. It's what we basically take from the standards, and a collection of us all get together and say, no, this is what the standard is trying to say. If you have a different interpretation to that collection, then we need to find a way to either educate better or to at least bring you on board. And I believe that's all. So if you've got any additional questions, I'll leave it to you, Pam, to coordinate that.
Thanks, John. We did have a couple of questions as you were going through that, but then they've retracted them because you answered the questions, so which was quite good and refreshing. One question is, in an organisation where BIM roles are not clearly defined, what job position more suitable should establish and address this information delivery plan? A BIM manager, an information manager, or someone else?
Okay, so I can't answer it specifically for your organization without knowing more about what they do, but take it from a principal contractor's perspective, who obviously have a big role to play in this on design and build contracts, because again, it changes on the procurement route. But typically the information planning process of design information specifically has always been down to the design manager. Now, that might not necessarily be true from an accountability perspective for construction and commissioning data, the stuff that may end up in O&Ms. So somebody else may need to contribute that. However, the design manager usually works closely with the design management teams, and subcontractors to make sure that whatever everybody does want gets passed down to them clearly, goes into appointments and is tracked and managed. If you create roles called BIM managers, BIM coordinators and stuff like that, I would always urge that you check to see what their responsibilities are. What is it that they're doing? Because one thing that you have highlighted by using the term BIM manager, the amount of times I've gone to a project and I've seen the design manager create this thing called the information release schedule. That's the tool that they've used for the last 20 years they've been in the industry for tracking deliverables. And that tool is being used as it should and is 95% compliant with ISO 9650 in terms of structure and what should be contained. And then the project will employ a BIM manager and they will create this thing called an MIDP, not knowing that the design manager has got this tool that's managing pretty much all the design deliverables, and they're being operated independently. And there's huge amounts of risk there, because one is trying to do something, the other one's trying to do something. They're not always talking to one another. And this happens a lot, and it's usually because people consider BIM as a separate entity. So I find BIM manager perspectives that they shouldn't really just be sitting there and creating these things and doing these tools. A lot of the tasks that are in the ISO and what was in the past was done by people already in the past. It just weren't done very well. So if you do have a person on your project that's this BIM type role, the two primary aspects of that role is to make sure that everybody's doing their job correctly. Is the commercial manager making sure that all the appointments and stuff do contain all of the information requirements? A lot of the time that used to get missed out. Is the design manager making sure that he's using the latest template, whatever the organization has said that he has to use? And finally, if there's any technical aspect, a design manager, for example, he will define, Mr. Architect, send me a particular piece of information. But the design manager might not be an architect, might not understand that information, so has to seek further review or specialist input from somebody else. And that goes for some of the now digital stuff like Kobe. The design manager will say, I want maybe a Kobe file at a particular point in time, but looks at it and goes, what the hell is this? And goes, okay, what do I do now? And we'll give it to somebody else and they'll go, yeah, I've looked at it. It now meets the requirements. That's fine. You can sign that off, Mr. Design Manager. And the design manager will make a choice if he does or not. So just make sure there's no overlapping of responsibilities. The information delivery planning process is undertaken by various, because various people input into it, but then there's usually like one person that will manage the process. And from a contractor's perspective, it's usually a design manager who manages the process, but he has to get input from everybody else. The design manager will focus primarily on the design information that's coming in, but there is all that stuff at the end that everybody forgets about, like the O&Ms, and is usually given off to some O&M subcontractor, and nobody really inputs into that, and that's a challenge.
Thanks, John. Before the next couple of questions, the acronym MIDP and TIDP stand for what? Just re-clarify that for us?
Yeah, so TIDP is Task Information Delivery Plan and MIDP is Master Information Delivery Plan. The concept idea in the guidance, and it is explained in the guidance, is the Task Information Delivery Plan is usually a specific delivery plan developed by a task team or appointed party. So let's say if you're a subcontractor, you're being appointed by another contractor, they're asking you to tell you, what information you're going to send us. When you send that over, the ISO calls it a task information delivery plan, but you can call it whatever you want. It's just what the name that's assigned in the standard. So if you've got your own name for it, it could just be delivery schedule. It's got to meet the requirements though of the task information delivery plan. Same goes for the MIDP. I don't always say that you have to go off and rename your information release schedule to an MIDP. You can keep your old names as long as it's compliant with the standard. But it always helps sometimes maybe to switch over to the new terminology, because then people aren't in the room talking about IRSs and then MIDPs, and it just becomes loads of acronyms. So it does help, but it's not necessary.
Okay, so I'm going to ask this next question without using acronyms, but it's not going to be possible. Doesn't requiring information container IDs in TIDPs and MIDP not help with aligning to the information standard naming convention, and also allows LAPs to monitor planned MIDP versus actual CDE report? Sorry, a lot of acronyms in that question.
Yeah. It all depends on your processes. Again, as somebody who tracks deliverables myself, would it be great if my tool could just say, this was what was planned, here are the exact names that was set up, and then what actually arrived, and then actually just give me an automatic report? That would be great, but there's two big challenges. The first one is I still have to, as a manager of this process, I still have to go in there and check the content. So I'm always checking every day what's come in and seeing what's there. And then I have to just quickly check over to make sure it meets my program. It's like anything on a program. Program defines what you need to receive, and then you go out and check to see if it's come in and you sign it off if it's there. But I did a study 2 years ago where I checked 6 projects that we had where we developed an MIDP at the start of the project and then took it halfway through the project and said that was the MIDP halfway through the project. And I compared both of these against what we actually received during that project. So the MIDP on one of them was something like 300 things that were listed in there. The other one was like 900. And I'd go to the document management system that we're using, and it was in the thousands, absolute thousands. So there was tons of stuff in there that wasn't even in this MIDP. So that was the first failure. The second thing that I observed was, though, it wasn't the actual MIDP that was at fault. The things were listed in there, but there was we'd got like large amounts of ceiling interface details, for example. You see, the MIDP was just saying first floor ceiling interface details and listed a single designation, a single ID. But the ceiling details that were actually released around about that time consisted of about 40 drawings. So there was actually 40 detailed drawings, whereas the MIDP had just planned 1. And that was where the challenge was. So then what they would have had to have done is they would have had to gone, okay, this is going to be 40 of these drawings now. I'm going to have to go back into the MIDP, update it and say it's 40. Oh no, I'm using a unique ID of 0440 onwards, which is my ceiling, but I can't use 441 now because 41's taken up by something else. So I'm going to move it into the 900 series. So that's a huge administrative burden for something that I don't believe adds a huge amount of value. But I must point out, you may have a process in place that works fundamentally for you, where you have mastered somehow the planning of the MIDP against what actually got delivered, and having that really consolidated down on your project. Now, I am aware of a couple of projects, and I'm not going to mention the consultant that supports them, that have got this hammered down and almost completely sorted. But I can tell you now, the huge amount of resources that consultant puts into making sure that that's done properly is, I would say, is typically not done on 90% of projects. And that's only because they're being paid a good amount of money to really control this on behalf of the contractor. And we use that consultant as well when we really want to try and experiment and control this as much as we can. But I'm not saying it can't be done. What I'm saying is the standard doesn't say it has to be done. But if you want to do that and you find that you find value from that, be my guest, you should play and experiment and see how you can achieve with that.
Okay, thank you. Final question for you. Should the level of information need be included in the MIDP? If so, what would be the best way to define it?
So there is a bit of a challenge and something that we've not really tackled with the guidance yet because we've not got a consolidated answer. So ISO 9650 does state that the task information delivery plan, so that's the schedule that's being pushed out by, let's say, a subcontractor or a manufacturer or something like that. They're pushing something out and then it has to contain level of information need in there. So the standard says it should contain that. What you've got to do is you've got to interpret then what is level of information need. Some of you may have sat in the other presentation about how level of information need should be approached. That is a relatively new concept. You see, the way that this was approached in the past was different in two areas. So before PAS 1192, we didn't have these things called LODs and LOIs. Okay, so the way that we used to define information need is we, as part of our responsibility matrix, will say, you know, I want a door schedule and this is what I want to know in that door schedule. And it might be that I want to know, you know, fire ratings, that kind of thing. Make sure that's in there. That's my level of information need for that particular container. Sometimes I might not ask for anything. I'll just say door schedule, and I'll leave it to the expertise of the person creating that, the architect, to know what should be in there as standard. And then maybe later on I'll say, oh, it would have been good if there was a fire rating in there, and I'll remember that for the future. So I used to define that in our responsibility matrix. And then typically what would happen or could happen is the architect would then say, you know, I'm going to issue you a door schedule and it's going to contain this information. And it might just either reference over to the document that I've created that defines the contents there, or it'll simply say door schedule containing the instances and type information. So it was a form of level of information need. It was just not standardized in any way, and probably each organization had a different approach. In 2013, that changed though, and we started playing about with LODs and LOI numbers, and then not only did you have LOD level of detail and LOI level of information, we also had level of definition, and then you had the American concept LODs, and it started to get really complicated. And the only thing that used to define level of detail free and level of I free was the MBS toolkit, and that toolkit, you could never rely on it because you couldn't configure it. So it would say that's what definitely should be included in the level of detail free, but I would disagree with a lot of that time, say I don't need that at that particular point. So the level of definition was very difficult to define then using that. And now we're in a new age. We've got a new standard, which is a European standard that defines level of information need and basically helps you define what information you should specify as part of your requirements. Now, your original question, should that be in the MIDP? It depends what your MIDP is. If you've got a tool that cross-links to other tools, so something that says, okay, where the requirements of that information container is defined in something else, it could link over to that. Or maybe you've got a really good tool, so maybe something designed on Airtable or something like that, that actually does define what the content should be of that floor plan or what should be contained within that schematic, then that's fine as well. I would say there's no single solution yet because people are experimenting with trying to be more clear about what their information needs are. And I've seen about 4 good examples and many, many bad examples. So I would say it's still work in progress in terms of coming up with a unified approach in industry. But that standard, that new level of information needs standard, could tip it to a particular direction and then a particular set of tools that support that standard.
Brilliant. Thank you, John. That's the end of this particular webinar. Thank you all for listening, and thank you, John, for a detailed presentation and discussion point. As mentioned earlier, these are all being recorded and will be available on the UK BIM Alliance YouTube channel next week. For now, thanks again, John. Thank you, everyone. Have a good weekend.
Thank you, everyone, for your time. Thank you.